In this episode, we're going to bridge a gap that trips up a lot of beginners. How you go from requirements gathering, which can feel like meetings and documents, to real security and privacy controls that people actually follow. The Certified in Governance, Risk, and Compliance (CGRC) mindset is that requirements are only valuable if they become consistent behavior, because a requirement that lives only in a document is not a control, it's a wish. Many organizations do requirements gathering, then move on, and months later they are surprised that the system doesn't meet expectations. Audits become stressful, and privacy obligations feel like last-minute chaos. The way out of that trap is learning how to translate requirements into controls that are clear, owned, measurable, and workable. That translation is the heart of operational governance, because it turns intent into practice without relying on heroics. We'll take this slowly and keep it grounded, so you can see why controls stick when they are designed well, and why they fail when they are vague or unrealistic. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGRC.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Requirements gathering is the process of deciding what must be true for a system or process to be acceptable, not just functional. Functional requirements describe what a system should do, while security and privacy requirements describe how it must behave and what boundaries it must respect. A security requirement might say only authorized users can access certain data, and a privacy requirement might say personal data must be collected only for a defined purpose and kept only as long as necessary. The first translation challenge is that these requirements are often written in human language that is broad on purpose, because early requirements are meant to guide, not to specify every technical detail. That broadness becomes a problem if nobody later makes it concrete. Beginners sometimes assume that the phrase implement access controls is itself a control, but it is not, because it doesn't tell you how access is granted, reviewed, or removed, and it doesn't define proof. The goal of translation is to convert a broad requirement into a specific control expectation that can be followed repeatedly. If the requirement is the destination, the control is the route you will actually drive. A control that sticks has 4 qualities you can remember. It is specific, it has an owner, it has a trigger or cadence, and it has evidence. Specific means it describes what must happen in a way that reduces interpretation, like access requests must be approved by the data owner before access is granted. Owner means someone is accountable for the control working over time, not just for writing it once. Trigger or cadence means the control happens either when something occurs, like a new hire, or on a schedule, like a quarterly review. Evidence means there is a record that proves the control happened, like an approval record, a review record, or an audit trail. When any of these qualities are missing, the control becomes fragile. If it's not specific, people do different things. If it has no owner, it gets forgotten. If it has no trigger, it doesn't happen. If it has no evidence, you can't prove it, and you can't even be sure it worked. The first step in translation is clarifying scope, because scope is what determines where a requirement applies and what it touches. A requirement about protecting personal data is meaningless until you define what counts as personal data in the system, where that data flows, and who interacts with it. A requirement about monitoring is meaningless until you define what systems are in scope and what events matter. Scope is also where governance shows up, because governance defines what the program considers important and what boundaries the program uses for accountability. Beginners often skip scope because it feels like paperwork, but scope is actually how you prevent hidden risk. If you define scope well, you prevent the classic problem where a team meets requirements in one system but ignores another connected system that handles the same data. Scope also prevents overreach, where you try to apply a strict control to everything and create unnecessary burden. Controls stick better when people understand exactly what they apply to and why. After scope, you translate requirements into control statements that express an outcome and a condition. The condition is the situation that activates the control, and the outcome is what must happen in that situation. For example, when a user requests access to sensitive data, Access must be approved by an authorized approver and recorded before access is granted. When personal data is collected, the collection must be tied to a documented purpose and limited to necessary fields. When a system is changed, the change must be reviewed for security and privacy impact before release. Notice how these controls are not describing a specific tool. They are describing an enforceable behavior. This is important for beginners because it keeps the control portable across environments. The exam tends to favor controls written as clear governance behaviors rather than tool-specific instructions. Controls that stick are usually the ones that can be understood by non-specialists, because compliance and governance involve many roles, not just technical teams. Clarity is a control feature, not a writing preference. Now let's connect security requirements to the main categories of controls in a way that helps you choose the right kind of control. Administrative controls include policies, training, approvals, and reviews, and they are often what makes technical controls consistent. Technical controls include system-enforced mechanisms like authentication, authorization, logging, and protections for data. Physical controls include restrictions on physical spaces and devices. A common beginner mistake is to treat technical controls as the only real controls, but in compliance work, administrative controls often carry heavy weight because they define accountability and create evidence. For example, you can have strong authentication, but if you don't have a process for removing access when people leave, your system can drift into risk. The best translation often combines control types. A policy defines the rule, a technical mechanism enforces it, and a review process verifies it. When those pieces reinforce each other, the control sticks because it is both enforced and monitored. When only one piece exists, the control tends to weaken over time. Privacy requirements translate into controls that often look similar to security controls but have different intent. Privacy controls emphasize data minimization, purpose limitation, transparency, retention limits, and appropriate sharing. For example, a control might require that data collection fields be reviewed for necessity, or that data sharing with a third party be approved and documented with a defined purpose. Privacy also demands controls around retention and disposal, because keeping data forever is one of the easiest ways to increase privacy risk. Another privacy control area is access, but the privacy lens asks not only who can access data, but why they can access it and whether that access aligns with the stated purpose. Beginners sometimes treat privacy as an afterthought, but privacy controls often fail for the same reason security controls fail: unclear ownership and weak evidence. Privacy controls stick when they are built into workflows, like requiring purpose documentation at the moment data is collected or shared. If privacy controls are added later, they become friction and get bypassed. Ownership is where many control translations fail, so it deserves careful attention. When a requirement is translated into a control, you must assign who is responsible for making sure it is designed, implemented, followed, and reviewed. Ownership does not mean one person performs every step. It means someone is accountable for the control's health. In governance terms, this supports integrity because it prevents the organization from pretending controls exist when nobody is watching them. Ownership also reduces conflict because people know who approves exceptions and who answers questions. A common beginner misconception is that security owns everything, but in mature governance, control ownership often sits with the business or system owner, with security providing guidance and oversight. This matters because business owners are the ones who understand the operational impact and who can make trade-offs. When ownership is aligned correctly, controls stick because the people who rely on the system also own the responsibility for keeping it safe and compliant. When ownership is misaligned, controls become external demands that people resist. Cadence and triggers are what make controls repeat, which is the difference between a control existing and a control operating. Some controls happen continuously, like system monitoring. Some happen when an event occurs, like onboarding or offboarding. Some happen on a schedule, like quarterly access reviews or annual policy reviews. When translating a requirement, you should decide which pattern fits the risk and the nature of the activity. For example, access approvals are event-driven, while access reviews are schedule-driven. Privacy retention is schedule-driven, while incident response is event-driven but requires readiness at all times. Beginners sometimes create controls that say review periodically, which sounds reasonable but is too vague to operate reliably. Periodically becomes never when nobody owns the calendar. A control sticks when it has a clear trigger and an expected time frame, because that creates a routine people can follow. It also creates predictable evidence because the control produces records on a known schedule. Evidence is the final piece that turns a control into something defensible, and it's also what helps you manage the program. Evidence is not about hoarding documents. It's about proving that required behaviors happened and were effective. A control without evidence is hard to audit and hard to improve because you can't tell whether it's working. When translating requirements, you should define what evidence will exist and where it will live, so it is not scattered across personal inboxes. Evidence should be tied to the control statement, meaning you can point to a record and say this proves the access review happened or this proves the retention policy was followed. Evidence should also be understandable, meaning it should show who did what, when, and what the result was. Beginners often think evidence is only for outsiders, but evidence is also for internal governance. It helps leadership see whether the program is healthy and where it is drifting. Another key reason controls fail to stick is that they are not realistic for the people who must follow them. A control might be perfectly aligned with a requirement, but still fail if it creates an impossible workflow, adds huge delays, or requires knowledge most people don't have. This is where governance trade-offs come back into play. Controls must reduce risk while still allowing the organization to function. A practical translation step is to test the control statement against real operations by asking whether someone could follow it on a normal day without special effort. If the answer is no, the control needs redesign, not more enforcement threats. Redesign might involve simplifying approvals, clarifying roles, or using automation where appropriate, but you can keep it high level and still understand the principle. Controls stick when they fit the flow of work, because people naturally repeat what fits their day. When controls fight the workflow, people work around them, and compliance becomes a performance rather than a reality. Good governance designs controls that people can live with. Finally, translating requirements into controls that stick means maintaining traceability, so you can always connect the dots from obligation to behavior. Traceability lets you answer questions like which control satisfies this requirement, who owns it, how often it runs, and what evidence proves it. This is crucial in CGRC work because audits, assessments, and leadership reviews all depend on clear connections. Traceability also helps when requirements change, because you can quickly identify what controls need updating. Beginners sometimes worry traceability is complicated, but the concept is simple. Every requirement should point to controls, and every control should point to evidence. When the program is built this way, it becomes resilient. You can onboard new team members faster, respond to audits calmly, and improve controls based on actual results. Traceability is one of the main ways governance protects integrity because it reduces the chance that the organization will claim compliance without proof. As we close, remember that requirements gathering is the beginning of the story, not the end, and the real work is turning requirements into controls that operate reliably. A control that sticks is specific, owned, triggered or scheduled, and backed by evidence. And those qualities keep it from drifting into wishful thinking. Translation starts by clarifying scope, then writing control behaviors that people can follow, then assigning ownership, defining cadence, and designing evidence as part of normal operations. Security and privacy controls both rely on these principles, even though privacy adds special emphasis on purpose, minimization, and retention. When you build controls that fit the workflow and maintain traceability from requirements to evidence, compliance becomes sustainable and security becomes measurable. That is the CGRC skill, turning intent into consistent practice without overreach, without chaos, and without relying on memory or luck. If you can do that, you're not just preparing for an exam. You're building the mindset that governance and compliance programs need to succeed over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.